To the house where
6 years ago, Stephen Lawrence was buried in Jamaica. His death was to have far-reaching consequences for race relations in Britain. At the time, few people would have predicted that an apparently ordinary black couple could successfully challenge the police and the government. The Lawrence case tested the assumption by successive governments since the 60s that good race relations would follow firm immigration controls.
What do we want? Justice! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Justice! When do we want it? Now! What do we want?
Neville and Doreen Lawrence were driven to campaign for justice by the failure of the police to find their son's killers. Their frustration led them to risk a private prosecution. It failed, and they were left wondering where they could turn next.
I had always kept in close touch with the Lawrence case because one of their strongest supporters locally was also a family friend of mine. And when their private prosecution collapsed, she was talking to me, she was saying, well, we really don't know where to go from here. And I suggested that they should come and talk to Jack, who at that time was Shadow Home Secretary.
I told him about how I was feeling and what had happened around Stephen and the fact that, you know, we've been denied justice and we have not been told the truth of exactly what happened. And I believe the only way to get to the truth is to have an inquiry.
Well, I listened to what they said. It was in some respects rather similar to many other meetings that I was holding before the election, which were on the basis of what if. And I said to them that I was very sympathetic to what they had to say, but naturally I couldn't say for certain what I would do if we won and if I were Home Secretary, but I would look at the matter very carefully.
We decided, therefore, that we would write to Michael Howard, who was the then Home Secretary. So I wrote to him and said that we'd had a meeting with Straw and how favourable the idea of a public inquiry had been looked upon by Straw, and could we have a public inquiry in this case to get to the truth of what happened?
I was troubled by the case. It was being investigated by the Police Complaints Authority. I thought that the more sensible course to take would be to wait for the outcome of the Police Complaints Authority investigation before deciding whether a public inquiry was justified.
3 months and a general election later, Straw, now Home Secretary, was in a position to influence events.
He had all his entourage there, so just to make sure that whatever was said was recorded and nothing was said out of place, and I thought it was quite funny, really.
Well, we were looking at what kind of inquiry was appropriate, and it's always easy with hindsight to say, well, this was the kind of inquiry that was appropriate.
At first, it seemed as if they just wanted to have something similar to what Scarman had done in Brixton, and so to be what we could do for the black community. And I told them that's not what I want, because I would never get to the truth that way.
Jack, I know, because I spoke to him afterwards, was very impressed by Doreen, very impressed, and she changed his mind. He went into the meeting with her, the meeting after he became Home Secretary, with his mind more or less set against a legal inquiry, and he came out willing to concede one. That, I think, was possibly Doreen's finest hour.
Sir William Macpherson of Cluny was called out of retirement to preside over the inquiry. It opened on the 16th of March 1998, but within a matter of hours it was adjourned. A newspaper article the previous day had implied that Macpherson's past record showed insensitivity on issues of race. Alarmed, the Lawrences went to see Straw. They demanded that he sack Macpherson.
I've said, you know, we don't want him, we don't want that judge.
He had the qualifications and he was available, so that was why he was chosen. We looked at a number of possibilities. He seemed to be the most appropriate appointment, and he was willing to do it, which is really rather important.
The inquiry resumed under Macpherson, but the Lawrence team believed their intervention had strengthened their hand.
In a sense, what we were saying to the world, to Sir William Macpherson and his advisors, was, look, we've put down our marker, we've set out our concerns. If, at the end of the day, a report comes out which doesn't look into matters in the way that we hope, which is obvious in this case, then we've set our marker, and we can then complain.
If he means by that that the result of the week's adjournment and what happened during that week was that I leant over backwards in favour of the Lawrences and against the police, then I would resent that suggestion, because I do not believe it was true, not one iota of truth in that.
Although the inquiry was not about finding Stephen's killers, Macpherson believed that the 5 suspects should give some account of themselves.
They were arrogant, and is that they can do whatever they like and they can get away with it because they've got away with it. And so they just didn't care. And watching them, and they had this like a smirk on their face and said, like, you know, you can't touch us.
The suspects supplied virtually no new information to the inquiry. But the real defendants at the inquiry were the Metropolitan Police. All aspects of their investigation were subjected to minute examination, beginning with the night of the murder. Critical was their handling at the scene of the crime of the prime witness, Stephen's friend Dwayne Brooks. One of the senior officers present was Inspector Stephen Groves.
When he arrived, he made the assumption, according to his evidence, that there had been a fight. Not that there had been a terrible murder in which young Dwayne Brooks had also been involved, but that there had been some kind of fight. And we believed that, in that sense, he stereotyped young Dwayne Brooks.
What that did, in relation to Inspector Groves, was to effectively close his mind to the possibility of going and searching for the real suspects, who Dwayne had said were had headed down a particular road. Now, that to me shows that the racism, the race stereotyping that was in Inspector Groves' mind played a significant part in the way the investigation was handled by the police on the night in question and thereafter.
Did you see?
I didn't see anything.
Nothing at all?
Definitely not, this time of the night.
There was very little difficulty, I think I have to say, in establishing that things had gone wrong in the investigation. But the probing that took place during the evidential phase was aimed at undercurrents and at motive or reasons behind the failures. And it was that which, of course, particularly the Lawrence legal team was aiming to establish. And we did detect, quite early on, in the evidence of some of the police officers, what we believed to be institutional racism.
Macpherson has said you've got to look at the totality of the way in which an institution works and see whether the effect, not the intention, but the effect of what it's doing is in some way discriminatory. And I think that has taken the definition further. Is a much more, it's a much more difficult concept to both to demonstrate and to grapple with. But grapple with it we clearly must.
It was a moment that I never thought would ever happen.
Madam Speaker, with permission, I should like to make a statement about the report of the inquiry into the death of Stephen Lawrence.
The fact that we as black people has managed to have caused such a change, it was quite something.
There is no doubt that there were fundamental errors. The investigation was marred by a combination of professional incompetence, by institutional racism, and by a failure of leadership by senior officers.
And to be invited there to see it happen, that was quite something.
The report says that institutional...
This was the first and only time I have been aware of the whole House being aware of who was present in the public gallery. There was an enormous sense of occasion, of the importance of what we were doing.
So I want this report to serve as a watershed in our attitudes to racism. I want it to act as a catalyst for permanent and irrevocable change, not just across our public services, but across the whole of our society.
A key recommendation in Macpherson's report is the extension of race relations legislation. Previous acts, all introduced by Labour Home Secretaries, have exempted law enforcement by the police.
We simply felt that fairness and justice required everybody to be subject to the same law, and that therefore there was no reason in these days for the police to be excluded from the full rigours of the Race Relations Act.
But I think it's very important, and we're going to do it as quickly as possible. I mean, it won't just apply to the police service, by the way, it'll apply to all central public services, including the immigration service and the prison service.
How quickly is quick?
Well, it's as soon as we can get legislation, but watch this space and watch the Queen's speech.
Politicians have been saying for decades that strict immigration controls are necessary for good race relations. Over the last 20 years, many Black and Asian Britons have made clear they think racial harmony requires further political action. It took a riot to give public recognition to racial disadvantage in Britain. Nearly 2 decades on, it took a murder inquiry for institutional racism to be placed centre stage.
I believe that inquiry had opened the eyes of a lot of people, and for the first time, people who before said, well, it's nothing to do with me, I'm not racist. They begin to question themselves.
Don't forget, when we began this journey, there was a real question mark as to whether or not Britain was ever going to be a multiracial, multicultural society. You still, in the old days, got the impression that some people felt, well, it was all a bad dream and one day they'd wake up and all the black folk would be gone. Repatriation was on the agenda. That's no longer the case. We are a multiracial society. The question now is the extent to which we make a success of it.
Frustration led them to risk a private prosecution. It failed, and they were left wondering where they could turn next.
I had always kept in close touch with the Lawrence case because one of their strongest supporters locally was also a family friend of mine. And when their private prosecution collapsed, she was talking to me, she was saying, well, we really don't know where.
To the house where
6 years ago, Stephen Lawrence was buried in Jamaica. His death was to have far-reaching consequences for race relations in Britain. At the time, few people would have predicted that an apparently...
Where to go from here? And I suggested that they should come and talk to Jack, who at that time was Shadow Home Secretary.
I told him about how I was feeling and what had happened around Stephen, and the fact that, we've been denied justice and we have not been told the truth of exactly what happened. And I believe the only way to get to the truth is to have an inquiry.
We want justice! When do we want it? Now! What do we want?
Neville and Doreen Lawrence were driven to campaign for justice by the failure of the police to find their son's killers. Their ordinary black couple could successfully challenge the police and the government. The Lawrence case tested the assumption by successive governments since the 60s that good race relations would follow firm immigration controls.
What do we want? Justice! When do we want it? Now! What do we